everyone. So you would have heard Felix's wonderful presentation on kind of what could be in relation to bail. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure this out. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's actually happening with bail. So basically, I think Felix already gave a rundown of how bail works in New South Wales. So this is basically just a different chart. When someone's arrested by the police, they can either refuse bail or dispense with or grant bail. But if someone's refused bail, they're taken to a court where the court can either make a decision to grant or refuse bail, or they're dispensed with. So I guess when I'm talking about bail decisions, I'm really only referring to those in that court group who are either granted or refused bail. So why do bail decisions matter? Again, it's probably something also addressed by Felix. Basically, if someone's granted bail, you run the risks of people not appearing in court. They might commit crime while out on bail, and they might interfere with witnesses or evidence. And so that's what essentially bail refusal is trying to do, to incapacitate people and thus prevent and mitigate some of these risks. At the same time, on the other hand, there are costs of refusing bail. So there are costs of housing the offender in prison. There are personal costs on the defendant because their liberty is taken away. But refusing bail could also act as a potential signal of someone's criminality. And that is something that there is a little bit of evidence for, but we don't know. So that's kind of what this research was trying to address. We want to capture the things from earlier that are a little bit less known. So obviously the cost of housing an offender in prison is well known, but we don't really know what the incapacitation effect is of bail refusals currently. But also the other thing we don't know is whether there is a signaling effect of bail decisions on the prison sentence. And what I mean by that is that quite apart from all the factors which would cause someone to receive a prison sentence, could the fact that they've been refused bail actually have an effect on their likelihood of going to prison? So bail is really hard to study for a couple of reasons. So consider the case where we're trying to estimate the effect of bail on a prison sentence. So, you know, that you would imagine the relationship to be like that, where something happens with the bail decision, and you would observe something in the prison sentence. Unfortunately, it's not quite that straightforward, because someone's likelihood of going to prison does influence the initial bail status that they have. So we have this problem of selection bias and endogeneity with regards to this question. And if we look at failure to appear or committing crime while on bail, so basically unwanted behavior, again, we have that problem, right? So someone who's likely to fail to appear or offend on bail is more likely to be refused bail. We have a second problem in that the people who are refused bail, and if they're held for the entire period, we can't actually observe them offending on bail or failing to appear. So to simply make a simple comparison, the people who are refused bail and the people who are granted bail, you would see that the people who are granted bail offend more. But that's not a reflection of what the people who are currently being refused bail would do if they were released. So there's been a few research papers which have tried to address these problems by using variation in judges' severity or leniency, bail judges. So the first one is Gupta, Huntsman, and Frenchman in the Journal of Legal Studies. And they used a sample in the US courts, I believe it was in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and they found that bail refusal increased the likelihood of conviction. It had no effect on reoffendings, and that was any time after the bail decision, and it had no effect on failure to appear. Recently, this study has kind of been subsumed by Dobby, Golden, and Yang in the American Economic Review, who used a very similar sample. I believe it was Philadelphia and Miami-Dade, but mostly Philadelphia, so very similar sample. And so if you can see, and it took me way too long to figure this out, they're actually very related. So the second paper actually tried to go into the results of the first one a little more. So as you can see, the first one found that being refused bail increased the likelihood of conviction. The second paper actually related that to the likelihood of pleading guilty and the likelihood of a prison penalty, which are kind of related to conviction as well. But of course, they used different, they used the reversed treatment measure as they looked at the effect of being released And as you can see, getting released on bail reduces the likelihood of pleading guilty, reduces the likelihood of prison penalty. They found a different result for failure to appear. Not too sure why that is, and they don't really address in the paper. But they also split reoffending basically into reoffending on bail and reoffending after the case disposition. And they find that the net effect is 0, so it's the same result as before. But when someone's released on bail, they're more likely to reoffend up to the end of their trial, and after that, less likely. And they attribute that to a criminogenic effect of being detained. And now there's a working paper that is trying to replicate this approach in the US federal courts. And what they find is that release on bail causes a substantial reduction in sentence length, but also increases the likelihood that someone will receive a below guideline sentence, so just a sentence that's shorter than what is recommended. And it's fairly large, because I believe that the federal courts in the US are quite punitive, but I'm not sure. So basically, I'm trying to replicate what these papers did. So I'm going to jump into how I did it, which is very, very similar to probably the Dobby, Golden, and Yang paper, so the American Economic Review paper. All right, so the first thing I needed to do is build a database of bail hearings attached to case outcomes, attached to offender characteristics, attached to reoffending. And this morning we heard about standing on the shoulders of giants. It's pretty much what you have at Boxa. So I started with the Justice Link database, which is the database used to record court data in New South Wales. And from that, I got all the first bail hearings. And attached to that, I got the magistrate who's presiding over it, the date of the bail hearing, the outcomes of the bail hearing, and the charges against that person at the first bail hearing. And I linked this to the Boxa reoffending database, which contains demographic characteristics, criminal history, whether someone received a prison sentence, the sentencing magistrate, convictions for failure to appear, and further offending. And so that's how I got my final data set. I had 42,362 bail hearings, and these occurred between 20th January 2015 to 30th June 2018. So the selection of the period was based on when the most recent major amendments to the Bail Act 2013 came into effect. So it's after, or the current policy period, as you would say. And there were adult defendants in the district or local court who had different bail and sentencing magistrates, and I'll explain that in a bit. And the bail magistrate had to have 20 or more decisions in a year. So I have 3 outcome variables, and they're all binary variables. So the first one is failure to appear, that someone is convicted of a failure to appear offense at finalization. I have offending on bail, whether someone committed an offense between the bail hearing date and finalization. And I have imprisonment, which is basically whether someone received a prison sentence at the end of their case. So, and the treatment variable, I'm going to use a dummy variable for whether someone was granted bail with or without conditions at their first court bail hearing. So I'll just note that the first court bail decision may not be, their status might not be the same until the end of their trial. It may be varied. So there are sort of variations. So someone who was granted bail can then be refused bail later. But an issue here is that potentially that could happen because someone who's been released, they go commit another crime, and then they're refused bail. And that creates even more indigeneity, which I don't know how to deal with. But so moving on to my control variables, I alluded to them briefly in what was in ROD. So we've got age, indigenous status, gender, socioeconomic status, remoteness. I've got details of the index charge, and these are coded into these broad categories of violent, property, drug, traffic, and other offenses. We've got their priors, which are there's 2 types. The previous penalties they received, and again, they're just coded into custodial orders, community orders, and other orders, and other penalties, I should say. And offenses, again, just coded into broad categories: violent offenses, property offenses, drug offenses, breach offenses, traffic offenses, and other offenses. And we also have a range of fixed effects. We have fixed effects for the principal offense, so usually it's kind of the most serious offense. They're very closely related. The time, so when I say time, it's of the bail hearing, basically the day of the week, which might be relevant for court scheduling, the month, the year, that kind of thing. And we also have the court location, the jurisdiction, basically district or local, and the police area. So before I go into sort of the nuts and bolts of how I did this, I'm just going to talk about sort of the conceptual idea behind it. So if you look at this blue circle, that represents all the variation in bail status and bail decisions. So as you can see, those bail decisions kind of depend on a number of factors, some of which we can see. So let's say the guy on the left who's refused bail, he's like an obvious bad-looking guy. You know, you can see why someone would refuse him bail. And on the right, you have this guy, shows up in a suit. People, the judge thinks, oh, this guy's not too bad. I'm gonna let him go. But some of these factors we can see. Some of these factors will be things like the severity of the offense. Some of the other factors are things we can't see. It might be mental health, there could be drug issues, there could be homelessness. These are all kinds of factors that kind of figure into the bail decision, potentially correlate with their outcomes, but we can't observe them in our data. So what we need to find is variation in bail decisions that's caused by a random factor which is otherwise unrelated to the outcome. And that's where the judges come in. So on the left, you've got this judge who looks pretty serious, and if a person gets them, they might be refused bail. But if they get this smiley judge on the right, the same person might be granted bail. And by exploiting this variation, we can estimate effects that are pretty unbiased, consistent. So basically, the method I'm using aims to estimate the effects of bail on that group of people. So let me go now into the equations, the nuts and bolts. So normally people would look at the relationship between two variables using a single equation model, like an OLS regression. Basically, they would put being granted bail into an equation to predict the outcome, which is y. So y equals to a constant plus the effect of the treatment, in this case being granted bail. You have your controls and your fixed effects, and you have your error. Now, the error is supposed to capture things you can't see, but because if the things you can't see are correlated with your treatment, they're going to show up in beta 1, which is the treatment effect that you're trying to estimate. And that's not good. So I used two-stage least squares estimation. So in the first stage, we obtain the predicted probability of being granted bail based on judge leniency, so our random factor, and I'll go into that in a sec, and other observed factors. So that's a predictive value, so the predictive likelihood of being granted bail equals to a constant plus the effect of z, which is judge leniency, sorry, I'll go back, plus the effect of all the different controls and fixed effects. As you can see, the error term's no longer there. Everything we can observe has been removed from that equation. And number 2, we'll estimate the outcome equation using the predicted likelihood of being granted bail. So using t hat from the first equation, you can plug that into an outcome equation and to get basically a better estimate where the measure of treatment does not include those things that you can't see that correlate with the outcome. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about how I derived the measure of judge leniency. And this is a little bit, so please don't be put off by the equation. Basically, if you think about a judge and whether you would think that they're lenient or severe, you would think about all the cases that they've dealt with and how many out of those did they choose to grant bail. The problem is when you're using, so you would get a proportion for each judge. You would get the number of release decisions over the total number of decisions. The problem is when you're trying to use that to predict a particular person's likelihood of being released, that particular person is included in that proportion you've just calculated. So you need to employ something called a leave one out method and remove all the release decisions and all the cases related to that person. And what you'll get is basically a proportion for that judge of how lenient they were in relation to all other cases except for that person. Then the ensuing problem is that people might say, okay, but the judge's decisions might actually reflect the cases that were allocated to them rather than their underlying leniency or severity. So that's why we take the additional step of residualizing this. And all that means is that instead of counting decisions to release, we try and get a better measure of their underlying leniency by removing the effects of the types of cases they receive. So in this case, I've taken out the offense fixed effects, I've taken out location fixed effects, and I've taken out time fixed effects. So those would just relate to, okay, particular locations, they have more of these types of crimes, or particular times of year, you might have different types of crimes. So basically, we get this measure of the judge's leniency relating to all other cases than the index individual. So for this to be a valid, for this measure of leniency to be able to estimate a valid treatment effect, we actually need to test a few assumptions. So the first one is relevance, that it should be significantly related to the likelihood of release. So basically, if our instrument is judge leniency, if you get a more lenient judge, you should be more likely to be granted bail. So here's a chart. And so the histogram shows you the distribution of this residualized measure of judge leniency. As you can see, it's fairly normal. On the top, I've just overlaid the relationship between judge's leniency and someone's likelihood of release. So basically, on the left, on the left of the distribution, you would have the severe judges. And as you can see, if you have a severe judge, you're less likely to be released. And on the right side, and you have a lenient judge, you're more likely to be released. And it's pretty smooth going from there. And the other common way to assess whether something's relevant is you run your first stage regression. So if you recall from the earlier slides, it's basically you test your estimate of someone's likelihood of being released based on the controls and this factor. So the partial F statistic of that first stage is 291.84. Generally, the rule of thumb for a good instrument is that it should be above 10. So we're fine. There are a few other tests. The first is that the distribution of your instrumental variable, it should be random, related to all individual characteristics. So basically, it shouldn't be the case that particular people get more lenient judges. And I find that generally that's satisfied if you're on a regression of individual characteristics against IV. You find that they do not jointly explain how lenient your judge is. The next one is monotonicity. So basically, the instrumental variable, in this case, judge leniency, the direction of the effect of judge leniency on being granted bail should be the same across different groups. So getting a more lenient judge shouldn't reduce someone's likelihood of being released on bail for any groups. And so this was tested, and we found that it was fairly consistent. And also, lastly, and probably most importantly, is that the instrumental variable, so judge leniency, it should not affect the outcome other than through the bail decision. And this one can't be empirically tested. Instead, we have to just provide reasons why it might not be violated. And in this case, I think we have strong reason to believe so, because firstly, defendants don't really get to choose their bail judges. Bail judges are assigned by a listing director. And defendants can't even manipulate the timing because they are usually brought to the court soon after when they're arrested. But also we excluded all defendants with the same bail and sentencing judge. So that was one potential mechanism by which this assumption could have been violated, because if you get a lenient judge at bail and then you get them later at sentencing, they could also be lenient in how they sentence. So finally, I'm going to move on to the results, and I'm just going to show you this chart. So let me explain what's going on this chart. So on the left, you have the estimate from the OLS, which only deals with controls and fixed effects. And on the right, and I should say that estimate does have error bars, they're just very tiny. And on the right, there's the two-stage least squares estimate. So basically, when we estimate it using the IV method, which will deal with controls, fixed effects, and deal with some of the selection bias, how does the estimate change? Well, what's the estimate? And we can compare the OLS and 2SLS to see the difference between them. And the gray bar is just the standard error. So as you can see, with the OLS, you can barely see the standard error because it's pretty tiny. With the two-stage least squares, it's a bit larger. And that's because it's a relatively inefficient method. It's basically your measure of treatment is something that's already predicted, so you have to factor that in. Those kind of reasons. So two-stage least squares is sort of more inefficient and therefore requires more data. So basically, we find that two-stage least squares estimates a 9 percentage point increase in the likelihood of failure to appear from granting bail, compared to a 6 percentage point increase. So basically, if someone's let out on bail, on average, the increase in the likelihood that they will fail to appear is roughly 9 percentage points. If we translate that into effects of additional releases, and let me just talk you through what's going on this chart. So on the left and on the right are the proportions of people who fail to appear among those currently refused and granted bail. And in the middle is basically the OLS and 2SLS estimate of what would happen if we released more marginal defendants, so people who are sensitive to judge leniency, who are currently being refused bail. So as you can see, if we take our two-stage least squares estimates as credible, this translates to a rate of failing to appear of roughly 10.9% for additional releases from that refused bail group. And as you can see, it's a fairly, and like I said, we have fairly large errors on that. But that doesn't indicate that there's an incapacitation effect of bail refusal on failure to appear. Now, turning to offending on bail, the OLS and two-stage least squares estimates were virtually identical. So basically, so basically, even controlling for selection bias, at least there wasn't much evidence for selection bias related to offending. And if we translate that into the effects of releasing more people, so as you can see, currently among those refused bail at first hearing, there's 13.2% who offend. Part of that reflects the fact that their bail status might be varied. The other bit of that is people can offend while in custody. It's mostly assault. But basically, if more people from this group were released, roughly about 29% of them would offend on bail, according to the two-stage estimates. So that would suggest that, at least as it stands, there's also an incapacitation effect of bail refusal on reducing crime committed on bail. Finally, imprisonment. So in OLS, so when we only look at controls and fixed effects, and we compare the people who are currently released on bail and the people who are refused bail, you see this huge disparity of 20 percentage points in their likelihood of going to prison. So that would mean that someone who is refused bail is 20 percentage points more likely to go to prison than someone who's released. But once we correct for selection bias using two-stage least squares, the signaling effect is really more like 10 percentage points. So basically, the same person, if they are refused bail rather than granted bail, their likelihood of going to prison increases by 10 percentage points. But that's still fairly huge, I would say. And if we look at the effect of additional releases, this would mean that if we released more people from the refused bail group, on average, those people who are released would have a rate of imprisonment of about 50% as opposed to 60. And yeah, that's. So I'm just going to run through a few robustness checks that I also did. So basically, the first one is misspecification of the outcome variable. So some of you might be wondering, why did I use linear probability models? Generally, there's very little difference between the results of linear probability models and the probit and bivariate probit, although they tend to have another assumption attached to them, which is joint normality. Either way, I also replicated the analyses using them, and the results were consistent. So, but of course, that paper can give you more information on comparing the two approaches. I also checked for heterogeneity in the treatment effects. So there's a procedure which is in this paper by Dahl, Kossel, and Mogstad to check complier weights, complier weighted OLS. Basically what this means is that I tested for the possibility that people who are sensitive to judge leniency react differently to bail than other people. And the results were robust to this. I also tested the sensitivity of the IV. So basically the results weren't sensitive when I changed the number of minimum judge decisions to 30 rather than 20. I did some subgroup analyses on the district and local court, and the direction of the effects were the same, but understandably, the magnitudes were slightly different for each. But I also estimated these results on the previous policy regime, so before the Bail Act 2013 came into place, and the results are consistent. So in summary, bail refusal does seem to reduce failure to appear in offending on bail, but it comes at a cost of higher imprisonment rates because of a signaling effect independent of someone's characteristics. But further work on maybe the cost implications of this kind of trade-off would really be needed to think about it in terms of value. Of course, and better prediction of offending on bail, like what Felix says, is kind of worthwhile, because it could be the case that, you know, in reality, you don't need to make these trade-offs, and I think that's what Felix demonstrated. But also, I think our findings are fairly consistent with previous studies that showed that there definitely is a signaling effect on either imprisonment or the penalties, likelihood of guilt, of getting convicted. So that's good, I guess, for me. But there are a couple limitations. So it's important to keep in mind that because of how the bail system works in New South Wales and the fact that I use instrumental variables, it relates to just a small subset of the offenders in New South Wales. But also, I didn't really have enough time to look at, they wouldn't have enough post-finalization time for those who were in prison to look at post-finalization offending like they did in the Derby paper. So yeah, that's probably it. All right, I'm done.
Thanks, Sarah. We have time for, I think, 2 or 3 questions. No? All right, run them up.
I'm wondering if you gave any, or if there's an ability to give consideration in the study as to time served, that a lot of people who are refused bail, and then their sentence reflects that they've been in custody for that period of time and then sentenced to a period of imprisonment by virtue of the fact that they've been been refused bail, rather than that their crime may be deserving of such a penalty.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really, really good extra analysis. Probably the reason why it wasn't done so far. So this work hasn't been published yet. It was getting quite large, so there's like a whole other analysis. But I definitely think that is one of the more interesting, like, further questions from this.
Yep. Yeah, just in the middle here.
So the conclusion you reach that it's based on the characteristics you have in the database, bail in itself is more likely to result in a sentence. Could it be that there are other characteristics outside the database that are influencing that aren't visible to this analysis or outside of this analysis?
So that's what two-stage least squares is essentially trying to deal with, right? Because when you look at that, you know, the first comparison I showed where there was that huge disparity, you know, obviously anyone would look at that and think, okay, it's probably not likely that simply getting bail refused by itself